From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is the week's worst with Allen and Vadum.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capitol Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President at the Capitol Research Center and Editor-in-Chief of BombThrowers.com.
And I'm Jake Klein, Media Producer at the Capitol Research Center, and I'll be moderating this podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. Although I think we have a story this week that we'll all be relatively happy about. This past Tuesday, June 20th, Republican Karen Handel defeated Democrat Jon Ossoff in a special election to represent the 6th Congressional District in Georgia in the House of Representatives. The special election was made necessary by former Representative Tom Price's move to become Secretary of Health and Human Services. It was a very closely watched election, with Ossoff polling ahead at times in what was once a safely Republican district. Over $50 million was spent on this election, making it the most costly House race in history. But in the end, Karen Handel won by 3.8%, 51.9% to 48.1%. So first of all, let's get the basics down. Who are our contenders here? Who's Jon Ossoff?
Jon Ossoff is the left wing's holy messiah. They developed him, they built him up to be basically some kind of a superhero who was going to come in and crush the evil Republican Karen Handel, who is associated with President Trump, obviously, as a Republican. And they just built this guy up who, to me, he strikes me as a flake. He's 30 years old. I was 30 years old once, too, a long time ago. That's not the problem. The problem is he doesn't have a clear sort of work background. He's supposedly a documentary filmmaker. No offense intended to documentary filmmakers.
None taken.
There are at least two of us in this room, maybe even three. And this guy, was such a lightweight. But for some reason, the left really got into him. He was taken as a symbol of the resistance against Trumpism, and people from Hollywood projected all these heroic qualities onto him. And I'm not saying he's a bad person. He seems okay as an individual. But they made such a big deal out of this candidacy, and they had so much riding on it, and they spent so much money. He raised something like $22.5 million on his own. And
then super PACs were active in the area too.
Super PACs were also active, and they helped Karen Handel. But by far, Jon Ossoff, this was supposedly the most expensive House of Representatives contest in American history.
Yeah, his campaign spent 4 or 5 times what her campaign spent. Now, when you throw in the outside money...
I thought it was more like 7-1, but yeah.
When you throw in the outside money, then he still had an $8 million advantage over her. So it's interesting how the media report it, because they report the total number, but they don't show I haven't seen one report that to mention the total number and then broke it down and showed the advantage that the Democrats had. But
and they raised a lot of money from San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Those areas, big liberal areas, so it was out-of-state money largely that was financing Ossoff. Handel got some out-of-state money, but I think not nearly as much as Ossoff did. He was viewed as an interloper by many, and he didn't live in the actual district he was running in, which isn't always a good tactic to accuse somebody of in a race, but here it actually had some traction.
Well, of course, it hits when somebody says something like, who are you going to vote for, congressional candidate? And the guy says, I can't vote in my own race. But the background of this guy it's typical, which is that the left is very good at finding people, raising them up, giving them the right connections that they need to be successful in politics or even in business, and that's what we have here. This is a guy who interned for John Lewis, the civil rights icon, who's become unfortunately a very harshly partisan Democrat in recent years, and he interned for him, and then he ends up, the next thing you know, he's this guy Ossoff is at Georgetown University. graduates in 2009, gets a bachelor's degree in the School of Foreign Service. Then he ends up at the London School of Economics, where he gets a master's degree in 2013. And then he's he becomes this documentary filmmaker, works for BBC Three, or at least his company does. And so now he's ready to run for Congress as this sort of golden boy who has all the right credentials. And we've seen this. You saw this with Barack Obama. You see this with one person after another. And it's just a shame that we don't do, on the conservative libertarian side, don't do as good a job of finding people and giving them credentials.
Absolutely, and there's nothing wrong with having credentials, I hope. But policy-wise, what did we avoid here? What did this guy stand for? What sort of wing of the Democratic Party would you describe him as being in?
Well, he started off as the kind of candidate who would run by standing, who would promise to stand up to Trump. And that's what you see in Democratic primaries. Those of us who live in Washington, D.C. or in Virginia, we've seen recently the commercials in the governor's race in the Democratic primary, and it was one candidate trying to do one up the other one over who was going to be more of a block for Donald Trump.
He came across to me as kind of a Bernie Sanders acolyte. But as I understand it, throughout the campaign, he tried to do some ideological cross-dressing as a conservative, and he started to suddenly talk about the importance of balanced budget. So Jon Ossoff painted himself as a fiscal conservative, and apparently it didn't work. The voters of Georgia, not enough of them were actually convinced by his pitch.
It's a tremendous advantage to a political party to be able to run a candidate who's a blank slate, because then you can completely tailor yourself to what you think the people are thinking in the district at that particular time, and you have no record to contradict that. I think back to Barack Obama, who introduced himself to the country in 2004 with the speech at the Democratic Convention as this person who was a unifier, who didn't believe in red states and blue states, but believed only in the United States of America. Totally alien to his background and the way that he would govern as president, and yet he was able to sell himself that way because he had nothing substantial in his background to contradict it. This guy hadn't even held office at all, and hadn't taken a stand on anything. I think they bragged that one of his documentaries exposed ISIS in some way, but beyond that, nobody knew anything about his views. So he could claim early in the primaries that he was this guy who was going to be the one person standing up to Donald Trump. And then when that was not working, as the race got down to the end, he could switch and be Mr. Fiscal Conservative, who's going to balance the budget.
So basically, Jon Ossoff was a mound of clay who was shaped into something by image consultants, and sold to the public on that basis.
And Karen Handel, on the other hand, has been around forever. She was Secretary of State in Georgia.
She ran unsuccessfully for governor.
Almost won in the Republican primary, which was the important race that year in 2010. Lost by 2,500 votes, I think, statewide.
Wow!
And she had been the assistant to the governor and had been involved in all sorts of controversies over the years. She was the person at the Komen Foundation. Remember the Breast Cancer Foundation, and they had a controversy because they were funding Planned Parenthood, and she tried to put a halt to that, and this made her a pariah in liberal land, and that's why Planned Parenthood was so deeply invested. One of the reasons they were so deeply invested in this particular race.
All right, so Planned Parenthood savagely attacked her at the time, and she was forced out of the Komen Foundation. The Susan G. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation, that is, where Handel worked as a vice president for policy, and she didn't take a severance package when she left the Komen Foundation because she wanted to be able to tell her story freely, and so this is, if nothing else, an indication of her personal integrity. And she wrote a book about her experiences, and she called it Planned Bullyhood. And I've read excerpts of it, and it's I was impressed. This is a woman with cojones, for lack of a better expression. And Planned Parenthood wanted to defeat her really bad and spent I believe, somewhere around 700,000 against her in the Georgia special election race. They gave the money, that is, to the Jon Ossoff campaign. So Karen Handel earned the enmity of the abortion lobby, and was fine with that. This is a woman who remains courageous under fire, and she could be a rising star when she takes her seat in the House of Representatives in the next few days.
Interestingly, she was endorsed in her various previous races by Sarah Palin, who has continued to do, and I've had a lot of discussions with my lefty friends about this. They don't realize that Palin is very quietly putting her people in positions across the country. Nikki Haley would not have gotten elected governor and therefore would not be UN ambassador without Sarah Palin, and Susana Martinez as governor of New Mexico. And then, of course, my view is that her endorsement of Donald Trump was critical to him winning the Republican nomination. So that's sort of a side issue, but it is interesting. And of course, the connection with Palin only drove the left battier that somebody associated with Sarah Palin might win this congressional seat.
So that was mostly focused on one issue, though, the abortion issue. Broadly, how is her policy stances? Where did she fit in the Republican Party? Is she, because especially we have all these divisions now, is she more establishment? Is she more libertarian? Is she more Trumpy? Is she more cruisy conservative, if I can create that phrase? How would you describe her? Are we happy with her?
I like cruisy as an adjective. That's a good one.
I do too.
And so can I use it about Tom Cruise movies? Ooh, that was so cruisy.
It can be flexible.
All right.
Yeah, she's actually, sort of a you might say a mainstream Republican for the state of Georgia, which would be a conservative by national standards. She was attacked in her governor's race that she barely lost. She was attacked for being too pro-gay, believe it or not. And
imagine that.
Yeah. And so, she, I think, would be one of the things I often say is that a rhino is not someone who is a moderate. A rhino is someone in the Republican Party who won't fight, who accepts the premises of the other side. And so I think she would fit in the category, perhaps, again, by Georgia standards of being a moderate, but not a rhino. Certainly when somebody has this kind of thing happen to them, when you have the entire world come down hard on you in terms of the Silicon Valley people, the Hollywood people, and so on, you learn your lesson. You have to stand up hard to them and be very be a pillar of strength, and that's how you win.
I think, Steve, I think you're right that nationally conservatives would view Karen Handel as one of their own. Broadly speaking, she is. Mm-hmm. And that was not a pun with the word broadly.
Right. And this is the district, remember, that Newt Gingrich was the congressman previously. Although people say, well, the Republicans held the district for 40 years, it's actually 25 or so, because the district was drastically redrawn by the Democrat-controlled state legislature back in 1990 in 1991 to nail Newt Gingrich, and they almost were successful. He barely won re-election the next time around because his district was so different.
The previous Republican was in the 1870s or 1880s and was a black freedman whose claim to fame was during the Civil War he commandeered a Confederate ship and piloted it to the Union Navy and became a big war hero.
So this is
interestingly enough, that's just a nice little digression.
This is the district that they used to. The late Louis Grizzard, the humorist, joked about that this area was filled with Yankees driving around Dunwoody in their Volvos, and so you have in this section of Georgia very well educated. It's one of the most well educated congressional districts in the country. I think the rate of college graduation is around 60%, which is almost double the national rate of college graduation for the people who live there. So
not that there's anything wrong with that. Remember, our president loves the poorly educated.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, importantly, even though this is in Georgia and you would expect Donald Trump to have done well there, he only carried the district by 1 point. and that was why Democrats thought they had a really good shot of the special elections this year.
But otherwise, it was an R+8 district, wasn't it?
Yeah,
to use the political lingo.
Yeah, and so this was number one on the Democrats' target list of the special elections early this year to replace congressmen who had been appointed by President Trump to various positions, and therefore you have to have a special election if it's a House seat, and that's why this was their top target, and that's why the irony is that they actually had a closer race the same day in South Carolina where they had to fill another seat. But if they put some of that money over there, who knows? They might have won that.
I don't think their Democratic candidate was quite the inspirational figure. I don't think he was as messianic as Jon Ossoff.
Well, one of the reasons the race was so close in South Carolina was because nobody paid attention to it, so very few people showed up to vote. So mainly the Democrats showed up to vote, and that's why they came close. So it's one of those things where, do you put a lot of attention if you're the Democrats? Do you put a lot of attention in the race? Drawing people into it, involvement from all over the country, knowing that that's going to fire people up locally. I mean, the turnout in the Georgia district was higher than it was in the previous, I guess, in the 2014 election. And of course, what happened here was that Ossoff got 49%, I believe, in the first round of the primary. He came very close to winning it without a runoff. If you get 50%, you automatically go in. He came very close, and then he got fewer votes as a percentage this time around. He got more votes, but because people were so fired up and the turnout went up, that caused him to get a lower percentage. He actually went backwards, and Handel went from 20%, I believe, in the first primary to obviously winning this time around. And that's, overcoming a tremendous disadvantage. I think 538 and a lot of the prognosticators had given the Democrats an edge just because Ossoff had so little that he needed to pick up to get a majority in the runoff, and he didn't do it.
While I was babbling there, I made one mistake. I just want to correct it. The Friedman Republican was Robert Smalls, and it was in South Carolina. It was in the South Carolina district, not the Georgia district. Robert Smalls, 1875. First, that was the previous Republican to represent that district.
All right, so, Democrats' number one target is one thing. The most expensive House race in history is quite another. So
by a big margin, it's like I think the previous record was 30 million, so this beat that by more
over
than 20 million.
Yeah. So, but what was it about this race? I mean, why this one?
Oh, this was because they kept selling it. And that's why, I see this as the week's worst, because if you look at the news coverage, it was all about how this was going to be the big referendum on Donald Trump. And this was going to show that the Democrats could come back and they could take the House.
Right. The Democrats tried to nationalize the election, and it worked to an extent, but the people in that district in Georgia weren't buying it. They viewed this as I'm sure some of them viewed it as a referendum on Trump, but a lot of them didn't. They just wanted to the status quo. They had a Republican as congressman before. They wanted to keep the Republicans representing the seat.
Yeah, and if you look at the four special elections, there was also one for the Democrats in California, where there was a Democrat district where the congressman got appointed Attorney General of California.
Yeah,
so
you're referring to Xavier Becerra.
Right, and there was no Republican seriously in that race. I think one of the 20 candidates was a Republican. Previously, the congressman had been unopposed for re-election in the last regular election. So putting that aside, you have the four where there were Republican incumbents, and there was a dramatic drop from what the previous Republican incumbents had gotten, but it was around 17, 18 points on average, or at least the median, and that's about what you get when you go from an incumbent who has the advantage of incumbency, who's gotten elected before, his name's known, got all the money, and then you switch in a special election, you typically lose about 15, 20 points for the party that loses the incumbent. And that's what happened in these four races. It was between 15 and 20 points for the most part. So I think that, it doesn't really tell you much about what's going to happen in the next general elections.
So Democrats wanted to position it as a referendum on Trump. Was it?
I think that, people always have a mixture of motives. I think it became that as you had all this money coming in from outside. I think it became a referendum on, do you want the Georgia congressional seat to be bought by people from Silicon Valley and Hollywood? There were a lot of factors. There was more time to sort of show the Democratic candidate to be someone without a record, someone who you couldn't necessarily trust, but not anything necessarily that he's a dishonest person, but just that he didn't have a record that would show that he would stand up and take a position and stick to it, and that therefore his promises were, should be discounted based on that. But yeah, I mean, on election night at the Handel Victory Party, when she gave her speech, the crowd burst into Trump, Trump, Trump. So clearly, the president inspires people to get out and vote when they see that there's a threat to him being able to achieve his agenda, and the Trump people feel motivated. They didn't the first time around because you had all these different Republican candidates, and they were splitting the message, and they were saying bad things about each other, and so a lot of people stayed home, and that's why the Democrats almost won the race outright the first time around in the first primary. But yeah, you're always going to have a situation where, particularly early in a president's term, or after the president has done something controversial, that you have this referendum effect, and people do vote locally, but they also vote nationally. That this idea that all politics is local is just nonsense.
I never understood why everybody thought that was such a great phrase. Tip O'Neill said that all politics.
Well, Tip O'Neill, it was to his advantage if people felt that way, because he was speaker partly because he had Southern Democrats who didn't necessarily agree with him on much of anything, who were holding those seats for the Democratic Party, and then those seats, and that translated into votes for him to be speaker. If you had a straight up and down vote based on political beliefs in the early 80s, Tip O'Neill would not have been Speaker of the House. So he depended on the party system to keep him in power. So of course, you don't want people in Louisiana and Georgia, South Carolina, voting based on the national issues. You want them based on voting based on whether they like the incumbent congressman, who maybe was a state senator before being a congressman. And, they got to know, and he's their buddy, and he comes down to the diner, and they hang out with him, and he shows up at the VFW hall, and it's all personal. And that's what you want. If you are trying to basically pull the wool over people's eyes in terms of the policies that you put out there, you want people to vote based on just totally local things. Who's your cousin, who comes to your meeting of the JCs, and all that sort of thing. You don't want it based on national issues. So of course, Tip O'Neill promoted the theory that all politics is local because it was to his advantage.
So we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but the funding of this race was interesting, not just in terms of number, but in terms of sources. The majority of individual donations to the Ossoff campaign came from out of state. The majority of individual donations to the Handel campaign came from within Georgia. What do you make of that?
The left is desperate for some sign of that they can turn this Trump thing around, and they're very fired up. If you get something out, if Rachel Maddow promotes your congressional race, if it's all over MSNBC, if it's in the other left-wing media, they will sit down and write out a check. I mean, they thought this was the opportunity to really punch Donald Trump in the nose, and so they stepped up. I mean, I got to give it to them. They put their money where their mouth is, and unfortunately, sometimes people on the conservative or libertarian side don't necessarily do that, but as much. But people enough did in this case.
And interestingly, Jon Ossoff got about the same percentage of the vote in the special election as he got in this week as he did in the first vote that led to the runoff 2 months ago, around 48%, 48.1%. So he maintained, but he didn't grow.
Yeah, sometimes you have a sneak up on them factor, and I can speak from personal experience. I think I'm the only person here who's actually run for anything. I ran for office a few years ago, and
You say that like it's a good thing.
yeah, well,
I ran for student council once. I lost.
oh well, there you go.
I won.
Well, my whole campaign was well. I won. I got elected to office in college, so I guess I can say that. But I ran for statewide office a few years ago, and my whole campaign, the premise of it, the strategy was that we would sneak up on the incumbent, and we sneaked and we sneaked and we sneaked, and nobody paid any attention to our race. And I think of the statewide races, ours was the only one that the newspapers didn't do any polling in because supposedly I didn't have a chance. And this was all working, and he wasn't really fighting hard to keep the seat because he thought it was in his pocket. And then 3 weeks before the election, the teachers union, which had the most reliable poll that was done in the state at the time, they came out with a poll that showed me with a 1-point lead. And people called me up and congratulated me. And, oh, this is great. Now you're going to win. You've got a 1-point lead. And I tried to, I tried to be nice. I didn't want to be throw cold water on it. But the fact was I knew we were doomed at that point because no longer would I be able to sneak up on them. And that's what happened with Ossoff. In the first primary, he was able to get 49%, almost get 50%, and then the same thing happened in the South Carolina race just this week because again it was not a high priority race and nobody thought that it was going to be close, and so it ended up being close because of the sneaking up on them factor. So that's always an important thing in politics.
This has been a changing district, and this is not the first election to show that. So it used to be Tom Price's district, as we said, and in his first run, he won the district by 20%. Handel now only won it by 3.8%. In 2012, Mitt Romney won the district by 23%. Trump only won it by 1.5%. What does that say about the current and changing state of the Republican Party and national competitiveness?
Mitt Romney had an advantage in some quarters because of his image as this very straight guy. Obviously an official in the Mormon Church, big family, and a husband of one wife, and that's a different persona. From Donald Trump's. Donald Trump, 3 wives, Donald Trump, reputation as a womanizer, all sorts of things like that. So you're going to get you're going to be stronger in some areas and weaker in some areas. Obviously, Utah was weak enough for Trump that you had the McMullen insurgency, and there was talk for a time that they might be able to split the vote, so the Democrats ended up winning Utah, of all places. So you're going to have in a district like that somebody like Romney, who's never said a vulgar word in his life, as far as anybody knows, is going to have a different appeal and not pull. Romney's going to pull much better in a district like that, other things being equal, than Donald Trump. Donald Trump, on the other hand, can pull in blue-collar areas where people want somebody that they'd sit down and have a beer with, somebody who will fight for them, somebody if they got into some sort of conflict would be the person who stands up for them and never backs down. And that in that kind of district, Donald Trump is going to do much better. That's and you're going to have demographic shifts in any congressional district. As I say, this one was drawn back in the 90s in order to knock out Newt Gingrich as the congressman, which almost worked. It's more Democrat than, say, the district to the west of it there. As I say, the shift in these 4 special elections was about what you would normally get when you're running in a special election after the general election is over, and so there's nothing to indicate there the Democrats would necessarily pick up the House, which is the big issue. What does this indicate as far as upcoming House elections? On the other hand, I think some of the prognosticators have said, well, based on this, the Democrats might pick up 12 seats. They might pick up 50, but most likely they'll get around 12. And, of course, that's not enough. They need a bigger shift if they're going to win the House in the next general elections.
All right. Do we have any final words on this subject?
It was a surprisingly interesting special election. And the left tried to score big, tried to flip a seat to the Democrats, from the Republicans to the Democrats, and they failed in that race, and they failed in 3 other races so far this year. President Trump and Brett Baer are incorrectly saying Democrats are 0 for 5 this year. No, Democrats are 0 for 4. They kept the seat in California.
Right. They were saying in competitive races.
They're hoping
and then counting the Trump election.
They're hoping this is going to be
cheat.
some bellwether, some foreshadowing of the 28 off-year elections for Congress, and so far it doesn't seem to be a foreshadowing of anything. It's just things are continuing, and lefties hate Trump, and haters gonna hate.
Well, I would say this. If the Democrats had won, this would have been a tremendous advantage to them in terms of recruiting, in terms of raising money. Recruiting is important because if you can get high-quality candidates, you're much more likely to win. And if people see someone like Ossoff winning, then they'll get fired up. There more people will sign up to run as candidates. So yeah, it does hurt the Democrats, which is one reason they scream so much.
And now they're screaming for blood. They're scapegoating Nancy Pelosi, who was just doing what she's always been doing throughout these special elections this year. But suddenly, a lot of them want to get rid of her on Capitol Hill in the Democratic caucus in the House, and that's a topic for another show. But I think that resistance to Pelosi and her own party, at least in Congress, is mounting, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out over time.
Well, Pelosi is famously left-wing, famous enough that you can actually get Republicans inspired to go to the polls by mentioning her name, and that happened in this election. If Pelosi had not been the Democratic leader and the person who would become Speaker if the Democrats got control of the House, then it's possible this would have turned out differently, because that was a big factor. And as one of the Democratic congressmen pointed out, yes, Trump has his negatives, and there are a lot of people who don't like Trump, but Nancy Pelosi is more toxic than Donald Trump. And if you know how toxic Trump is in some places, that's really saying something.
All right, that's our show for this week. We'll be back next week, and we hope you'll join us. If you're not already, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, and follow us on social media at Capitol Research Center on Facebook and YouTube, and at Capitol Research on Twitter.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capitol Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, but I'll skip my title.
And I'm Jake Klein. Thanks for listening.